So I basically don't know most of everybody here. So my name is Sam McAllister. I live down in Mapleton, Oregon, tiny little place. And I've been, burdened with the law of God and the standards for righteousness for a number of years now. Not that many years. But my background is one of a homeschooler from starting in the 1980s. And up through that time period going to law school, and it was a Christian law school, but it was still just the secular stuff. You had to deal with everything that would get you through the bar exam. And not doing that, thank the Lord, that was not His plan for my life, and that is, in fact, something that I agree with now, but I would not have agreed with then. Telling you to do the whole law school thing and then not be this lawyer driving a BMW, right? So, being married, having children, getting some of those children married, having grandchildren. And so the law of God, applying it in my life on a daily basis, in the family, and in the areas that were naturally coming to me, and trying to see what God thought about those things, and trying to figure out, and knowing that in His sovereignty, He has something to say about all aspects of life, because all aspects of life, done right, glorify Him, done wrong, are in rebellion. So I want to preface a little bit of what I have to say today with holding all, jeers and questions to the end. It's not going to take very long. And I understand that I am in a very minority position in the theonomy and Reconstructionist position, but I did not come to such a position lightly after reading the Institutes and enough other argumentation. So we start with Psalm 119, which is a psalm that meant nothing to me for a long time. In fact, it was just a long one that our family would read in the morning, and I couldn't wait to get through it. Verse 4 says, "Thou hast commanded us to keep thy precepts diligently." So the very basic nature of the law of God is a call to personal obedience. Each of the 10 commandments calls a single individual to obey personally where he is. While this concept seems obvious from the outset, it does have far-reaching implications. Consider that the things the law does not tell us, consider that the things the law does not tell us is almost as much about what it is. So what it touches on and what it does not talk about tells us something also. It's a hard statement to understand, but it when you look at it and then you ask the question, why did he not say this? There's an answer to that that's implied. Well, think about this. Where in the Scriptures does it say to feed your children? So the silence of people's, it's like, but it's assumed that the righteous man does. In fact, it's assumed that the evil man feeds his children, isn't it? And in fact, the man who doesn't is worse than the infidel. So there are implications in the law on what it says and what it doesn't even have to say. For instance, it is not a call to create or invent institutions, the 10 Commandments, and that which is outside of it. And while the law does classify a strata of persons, so it does classify individuals, it does not give a call to create new strata or classifications, but rather it's a call to personal obedience. Each man carries with him equal responsibility to the law as a person affected by it. Psalm 119 says in verse 11, "Thy word have I hid in my heart, that I might not sin against thee." Now these are the words of a king of Israel. And I don't think they're any less true should he have written them before he was the king or after. He was the archetype of the Christ, right? He was a picture. He is a man subject to the laws of God, only specially singled out for extra regulation and not less. as the anointed of God, he had no power or authority to legislate. He didn't even have the authority to number the people. So in 1 Samuel 8, you knew I was going there, right? Verse 5, and we all know that chapter. And I just single that one out, and you guys can fill in. You've read it. You know the rest of it. It says, and God had said unto him, Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now, the children of Israel were saying to Samuel, and said unto him, Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. So they were asking for something that was like the nations. They did not want a normal king, a leader of men who arises as of need. There were kings, but they did not, they only led. They might try to legislate, but in doing so, I believe they were, tyrants. And so they were not within the law and the righteousness of God to legislate. To lead is one thing, to legislate is another. They further did not want a sovereign king who was this king among kings. Their actual deliverer who had delivered them so many times in the time of the judges. Consider, I believe, that the longest time period that they were under oppression was 18 years. How long have we been under oppression? How many years of peace did they have in a row? It was a peaceful time in Israel's history, actually. A very peaceful time. But that's beside the point. They just came out of that history, right? And he was this God up in heaven. They couldn't see him, and his rules were just too restrictive. Possibly. I'm kind of postulating here what they were thinking. They wanted these kings. They were asking for a human sovereign king endowed with the authority to make rules and force men to obey them. They needed a king who had the authority to act outside the law in the interest of safety and security, of course. He would never abuse such a thing. I don't know why they would ask for such a thing, but they had to have known. But I'm just postulating some of this stuff here because I think that's fairly close to what was going on. Only such a thing would be a safe bet in today's dangerous world, to have this human king. He could save us. Plus, all the other nations had them. So I guess it was kind of that argument like your kids have, right? Israel should have one too. They could be more respectable among the nations. This is a significant departure from the laws of God. He did not institutionalize kings. And certainly they could not legislate, or this king, or be above the laws of God, which is the very nature of a sovereign. He is above the law. He makes the law, but he is not subject to the law. I want to, define that for you. So in 1 Samuel 8, verse 10, it says, And Samuel told all the words of the Lord who had talked to him unto the people that asked of him a king, and said, This will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and some shall run before his chariots. Now we know the whole rest of the thing. He's going to take your daughters, and he's going to, all this stuff, and he's going to tax a tenth of everything that you have or own. A tenth. Does that not sound a little blasphemy? It's like a slap in the face to God that this king would take a tenth. Now, of course, we in this nation today would love to see only a tenth taken, wouldn't we? And taken from only the first of the fruits of the land, instead of like every transaction. Now the rest of the passage is similar in scope. I'm talking about that. The point is that the list is not God's legislation for what a king is, but rather it outlines the curse of the king of the nations. We know the curse when we see these things. These things tell us that we're being cursed. No Christian should desire these things. This passage further underlines the marked absence of administration or administrative institutions in the law, and especially administrative law. I don't know how many here have had experience with administrative law. In the Federal Register, I believe 60 pages a day come out. And I'm going to tell you, I believe all of God's law, that probably includes most of even the ceremonial law, that I wouldn't, I have not studied and will not sit there and advocate such things, but I've not studied it, so I'm not going to say authoritatively anything on it. Still, I would guesstimate 23 pages. We have 60 a day of administrative law. Force of law in this country, written by people who aren't even legislators. Now, that's to say that if that, then also the legislators are out of order. Instead, all men are personally and universally required to be obedient to the law as it applies to them. So, my next section that I'm talking about is the problem of institutions and administration of the law of God. Proverbs 31 says, in verse 23, "Her husband is known in the gates, when he sitteth among the elders of the land." Considering this call to personal obedience, one would have to find a personal call to himself by God within his law, God's law, in order to create some institution. Further, the very administration of the law of God has to be accomplished according to his standards. While little is said about this, what can be reasonably assumed is God's desire, the desire by God for a minimal bureaucracy, not the maximum. In fact, I would say, when I say minimal bureaucracy, you can imagine, you're thinking, we pare it down a little bit. No, it's like, you won't believe how small I could defend and how small I would attack from Scripture and say that it's too much. So what I was talking about, the husband was known in the gates. What happened and happens in most societies that are not institutionalized after like the Treaty at Westphalia and stuff like that. The elders of a town are the natural leaders of a town. They're successful in business. They're wise. And in, of course, a Christian society, they just naturally are there. People go to them. Why? Because they know the Scriptures and they apply them in their own lives. They have success. And the people can see that. And these people who sat in the gates rendered advice to people that needed it. They also rendered judgment. So when two men had a business problem or anything else, or in fact, should this town be that bad that there was a murder, these guys would probably be the natural people that would be run to if there were any evidentiary issues with this murder. In fact, they're also, according to the law of God, we know, they are responsible for unsolved murders. And they're the ones who pay for an unsolved murder by the breaking of an ox's neck, which is like taking your family bulldozer and setting it on fire. It's no longer useful at all. And then you don't even get to use the steel for scrap. So a judge arises by need and desire of the parties to settle a dispute, not an institution that is a forced thing. In other words, you have only one choice. Certainly, the parties are required by the laws of God to seek such a thing. Remember the personal requirement? We are to seek judgment should it be, necessary. We can't take care of something ourselves. As Paul was talking in 1 Corinthians, in chapter 6, they couldn't solve their problems, and they were going to a secular court to solve problems between themselves. You guys not only should be able to solve your own problems, you're going to be judging the angels. Now, understand that there's no punishment listed for not doing so, not going to this to go get judged. That is because avoiding judgment puts one outside the law. Now, every lawyer who goes to school forgets this one. It's kind of early and it's in the big thick books, and they kind of forget this as a defense. When you have done something illegal, you're in an illegal transaction, or you're in an illegal deal, you're robbing someone or stealing their something, or you're conducting illegal business, like imagine prostitution is something that would not be protected by law. So morally, you're culpable. You don't have the choice to go to the court system. They call it the doctrine of unclean hands. So if your hands are unclean, you cannot ask or petition the court for redress. This comes from a biblical concept of the covenantal model, where when a person is a covenant breaker, he does not have the benefit of law. He's flaunting the law. Why should he also be able to come and ask for redress? Okay, so when he goes to court, if you can imagine, if a guy refuses to go to court when somebody says, we need to go to the elders because we can't get the, and he says, forget it. I'm not going to do this. It's not going to turn out my way. We're not going to go to court. You're just going to have to deal with it. So whatever, so you imagine it as a business transaction. This person is now outside the law. He won't go to court and be judged. Now, it could be bad and it could be good. Could come out in his favor. Might not. But, it's just because you have a human administration of the law, obviously it's not going to be 100% perfect. Evidentiary issues, he may not be able to prove his case. But he should probably go there to remain inside the law. Because what happens is, should that same person, he says, oh, he won't go to court. So he goes and takes, 4 tires off his car. Says there's payment for that shortfall in that business dealing. He can't just go to court now and go, hey, you stole my 4 tires, give them back and 4 more tires. Because he wouldn't go to court. He doesn't have the ability to go to court. Okay, he doesn't have, you can't go to for redress at that court because you already flaunted that court. You already flaunted the law. So that's where we come up with the concept of the outlaw. Remember the outlaw? Okay, someone kills an outlaw. He doesn't have the right to redress for murder. Because he's outside the law. He doesn't get the protection of the law. And understand that's a very large concept within God's legal system specifically. If I were to argue cases in court, these are the issues that would come up from a biblical perspective, taking those pages of law and the prophets and trying to make cases only from that. Not human reason here, because what we're doing is we're seeing what he said, and he has given us enough to take care of these human problems without legislating or anything. There is enough case law to handle all cases of human interaction in God's law. If you don't believe that, I don't know what to do for you. Because I believe in the sufficiency of Scripture. I believe in the sufficiency of the law of God. Not added to. Not helped out with administrative rules or bureaucracies or institutions that he has not called for. Okay, so I've covered some of what I was writing, but I had to explain it a little better. Yeah, so wrong's now done to the man who's flaunted the law. He has no recourse. This is a fatal situation in which no rational man wants to find himself. So this is the beauty of the laws of God, to have maximal effect with minimal legislation and administration. We have judges arising as of need. So a system where all the Christians are just obeying the law of God, you don't have this bureaucracy over here, this court system or something just languishing, because it isn't needed. And it isn't something that is, you have choice of law, which is another legal concept of, change of venue, judges have to recuse themselves. This comes from the very nature of the reason why Deborah was a judge. Because she was good at it. Of course, in my opinion, it was a slap in the face to the men who weren't doing the job. The ones who were there that would normally have been there weren't there. I know, of course, imagine that they're not doing their job and they become under oppression from, this outside source. So the beauty of these laws is to have maximal effect with minimal legislation and administration. It speaks of a master legislator and an infinitely benevolent dictator, concerning which the call to emulate exists within the role of the Father, another institution created by God. Now, the beauty of a call to personal responsibility, this is where I want to end, because it's like, this is food for thought, because the implications of what I'm saying are far-reaching. Psalm 119:18. I don't even have to get far into Psalm 119, and I've got just quotes everywhere, don't I? Open thou mine eyes, that I may behold wondrous things out of thy law. There's a man who tears come to his eyes when he writes the Psalms and when he thinks about the law of God as this horrible and harsh thing, right? Except for he didn't think so. The beauty of a minimalistic law system and its call to personal responsibility is the realization that we are in control of our part in it. This is the uplifting part. It's like, what are we going to do about this? What are we going to do about that? While the blessings of obedience are national, we know this, right? And the cursings of disobedience are national, the call is to individually obey. This is liberating. I think you were talking about being liberated from all these. The law is liberating. This means that we are constructing the kingdom wherever we are obeying His laws for us. It's the standard for construction. It's the standard for righteousness. The rightness of what we're doing is measured by it specifically and in general, but the specifics tell us what the general principle involves. Whether this is as a parent or in our business work, our obedience brings national blessings. We do not worry that we are somehow not building some institution to administrate His laws or taking over some man-made institution. Now, I understand that you've done a lot of work, and I'm not here to complain about anything, and I'm saying that Reconstruction or obeying God's law totally can be done within our home, but as we move outward, the things that we do, I think, will change. How we deal with this right now in our oppression, we have to change ourselves first in everything that we do within our home, or we do not secure those blessings to have those things that are larger change, that are outside the home. So, obviously, I'm not saying a person shouldn't vote, but he should not support the creation of institutions that the law does not tell us to. And I personally don't believe that we really have much that we can even look at that's anything more than a voluntary system of, loose association and treaties or something like that for, common defense and a little bit other stuff. But that's my minority opinion. We do not worry that we are somehow not building some institution to administrate His laws or taking over some man-made institution. This is not the call. We bring about national blessings starting within our own families, teaching our sons and our daughters to obey. This obedience naturally extends outward in our life, where we naturally have choices in business and civic life. There is civic life. Obviously, His laws should shape our ideas of business and civic life, just as they do our ideas of family life. Remember, the specifics tell us something about the general, but the specifics help us tremendously when a situation comes up. I find this concept to be the most liberating and encouraging, that I can immediately control all of my part in building the kingdom, and that it rests within the sphere of my own personal influence. My obedience is for me, my obedience is for everyone else, but it's something that I can actually do something about. I don't sit there wringing my hands about something that's going on that I can't control, or other people's obedience. I can't control their obedience, but I can work on mine. There's no worry now about others and their obedience or their lack thereof. I am called to punish or judge only that which falls within my personal responsibility to His laws. That statement has a lot of implications from a very specific sense in the law of God. So that realization takes a load off of every man's shoulders, and it is the blessing bestowed upon us by the only benevolent and righteous tyrant. Because God is the only one who has the right to tyrannize. This is from Rushdoony. Reread his first 40 pages. So what he said, because everybody's like, what? God is a tyrant? Yes, he is. Because you understand that a tyrant is a man or a person, because God is a person. He's a spirit. He has the right, the only one, to make law for others, and he's not subject to it himself. Can God kill? Yes. Can God judge? Yes. Does God make the rules? Yes. Can he legislate? Yes. Can anyone else? No. He's not given it to man. And so, yes, he is a tyrant, but we know from the law that he is the only benevolent and righteous tyrant. Psalm 119, verse 45 says, "And I will walk at liberty, for I seek thy precepts." So that ends what I have for right now.
Okay, so we want to do a question and answer time. So we have 20 minutes or so for that. So why don't we get right into it? Who has questions or comments?
I do understand that that's a lot of food for thought. So
Aiden's mic is turning. He has something.
There's someone over there. Can you restate your last the statement you said has a lot of implications? What was that statement? Do you have it in a sentence? You said
the broad implications of punishing or judging within the personal responsibility of his laws. That would be understanding that the concept of punishing for death penalty offenses is something that falls upon his people. Remember, personally, he did not say, "And you shall create a police force and a court system," but rather he's saying you shall have judges. Well, who? Well, it's just one of those natural things. He doesn't say you should have leaders, but by golly, you do, because how are you going to have a war or a defensive deal? Okay, so we look over to what his call is for death penalty offenses, and I disagree with Rushdoony on this one, because his eyes go up. The reason why is because the call to prosecute is something that falls upon the victim and the witnesses. So these people arise by the circumstance of proximity to the violations of God's law. So you don't have busybodies going around going, we need to arrest this person. So everybody that I used to debate with theonomy was, there's going to be blood running in the streets because all these people are going to be killing, all this stuff. The truth is, it's you look at homosexuality. It's they're going to go over and kill all the, homosexuals. The truth is that in a biblical society, that sin would be so hidden that they wouldn't want it to come out. And being that maybe not a lot of people want to do something about something like that, when it becomes so stinking and open, you have to do something about it. You wouldn't even have to have a trial. What would be the evidentiary issues to someone who claims outright that they have committed a sin that is a death penalty offense? You don't have to have a trial. Your duty arises just like the blasphemer, the one who rises up in secret and says, "Let us go worship another god." Who is the person who is called to obey there? Some outside institution or the person who witnessed it? He's the primary. The parents with the child who is a reprobate and he's rebellious and he's just he's a stink upon the community that he's in. It's their fault and they should be taking care of it. Now they don't, right? Well, that kind of stuff. The way that God's law works is that stuff hangs out in the sense that we can't hide our sin. We're not whitewashing it. His law says this is sin, and when you're not doing something about it, it looks like it. Consequently, go ahead.
So I almost completely agree. I agree that it's the offended person or the person who sees it that brings it to a court or prosecutes the crime. Right. So if you've been stolen again, if someone's stolen from you, you're the one, or your family, you can represent them, you prosecute, right? But the only place where I see that not happening is in cases of murder. because it's not the individual who's crying out, but it's the land that's crying out. It's the blood
that's the curse
of the land.
That's the curse that he's talking about that comes with it because it's unrequited blood. Now, in the case of murder, what is supposed to be done? What's the first thing mentioned? All right, so he's lost it. Okay, here's the deal. This is why I believe what I believe. There was the avenger of blood. So this is kind of this halfway quasi-witnessed, somewhat potentially accidental murder. It was like this one that had issues. So there was the city of refuge for this case where if it was an intentional one, they killed him. If it was an unintentional one, he had to stay in the city of refuge. But who chased him? The police, right? The avenger of blood. Who's he?
Rushmany taught that there's two avengers of blood, that there was the unjust avenger of blood that was unjustly seeking a person who did not murder someone, and then the just avenger of blood who was a prosecutor of, prosecuting the death.
Yeah, can you imagine who that person would be, though?
Probably
naturally?
The offended person.
Okay, he'd be the family of the offended person. In other words, you got your guy, he's fit, he's the guy who can run, he's the guy who you don't want to mess with. That's the guy selected in your family as the avenger of blood. Obviously, if somebody gets him, you got your secondary avenger of blood, right? Maybe your thirdary. Okay, so everything is right within this naturally arising deal where the personal obedience to these commands, when we really care. Do we care about murder? Well, yeah, and so we should do these things. Now, obviously, we're in a system that doesn't work that way right now. So I'm not advocating that we go out and instantly do this thing. It is a process by which we can free ourselves from oppressors so that we can actually obey the righteous law of God. So go ahead if you had any more. Go ahead.
So actually what you just said was maybe a good segue. In a corrupt pagan society like we live in today, that incorrectly prosecutes murder and actually has, like in the case of abortion, thousands of murders every single day, and nobody seeking justice for those murders. How do you see, how do you see like a vision for Christians, like looking both right now and then into the future? It almost seems unfathomable, like how to approach this, like from a biblical law perspective, because we can't in the system go and seek justice for those victims without ourselves being prosecuted as murderers.
Right. It is righteous to take care of the situation. Now, think about this. You're not, okay, do I need to restate that or he's good with it? Okay. And everybody heard what he was talking about. Okay. The specifics of the law would say that, say, a woman aborts her child, okay, but she's lives over on the other side of town, you're not related to her or anything else, okay? What happens is, like from a biblical law, the way that it would be seen in a judges type situation, you remember the Benjamites had this problem city where, the concubine and all that, right? Okay, that tells us something about not necessarily all the right responses, but kind of a natural response to the thing, which is these guys are just letting something go on in their town, and eventually it spreads to the exterior towns, and now something is going to be done. And it was done from the outside in, because now the elders were complicit with this problem. Now, from a biblical, from a Reconstructionist perspective, there is one thing that I believe that we need to do as a church, 100%, and nothing will change until we do this thing. Nothing. We need to cut down our groves and our idols, and we need to fall upon His mercy, because we have created institutions, we have supported institutions, and as a church, we are idolaters from the word go. I can tell you, I can find an idolater by blaspheming his God. And I'll tell you what, they want to kill you. Light a flag on fire. How many of my friends at church would probably put a bullet in my head for it? Nations are not governments. And that is the first conflation problem. But my opinion is that we are under judgment because we continue to be idolaters in the Reformed Church and all the way in every denomination. We have problems with idolatry because we add to his law and we are looking to institutions to fix our problems and people. Vote for Trump, he'll save everything, right? Oh, vote for the other guy, he'll save everything. Oh, what about the Christian whatever? Oh, he'll save everything. No, it starts right here in our own hearts, and we kill the idols. We cast them down, and then in that true repentance, I got to tell you, in the book of Judges, I told you that it took 18 years for the longest. I think it was 18. I'm just going off the top of my head. I believe it was 18 years that they were oppressed, but it took very little time for God to deliver them. And funny enough, I'm going to tell you something. If you reread Judges, the guys that I think are more like what we need to be are the guys that have no drama stories. I think their first deliverer rose up and delivered them. And they had peace for 40 years. They had peace for a really long time. And this guy did not have any prophets go to him, it doesn't say, or anything. He just rose up and did it. Why? Because it needed to be done. And I think they were at that point where they were able to remember God, and he was able to be a judge, or the judges came back and were judging according to the law of God. Well, as much as they were. Remember, they forget God. But I think idolatry is our biggest problem. So it starts at the bottom and it goes up, and then those things will take care of themselves when we have done those things. But right now, we go to our a Supreme Court and we want them to fix our abortion problem. But I hate to be almost like trite, but our abortion problem is in here. And until we give up our idols, I don't think we're going to... The land is just crying out with blood.
Yeah. Korbin, did you have one?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So how do you draw the line between an avenger of blood and someone who would be taking vengeance out on somebody in their town, like somebody murders somebody, and let's say somebody that was important to you, and you want to take vengeance out on that person, but that's vengeance belongs to the Lord. So how would you be a just avenger of blood and still not carry out?
Imagine the trial that results afterwards. Okay, so you got your deal, and you have to think of a person in their incentives. He's going to go take out a person that he believes justly should not live. If he is taken to court for murder by the people around him, even the elders of the town are like, hey, we know you, and this is not right. He's going to have to prove the case of why that man was not inside the covenant, was a covenant breaker before that deal. I don't see, and wanting to stand trial like that is something that a person would have to, I think that a person would not lightly do that. I don't think that's really a problem that people are worried about. Some of these problems that I don't think in a biblical system are really actually going to occur in real life. I live basically in complete anarchy where I live, and it's incredibly peaceful until authorities show up and screw up the balance of things. Everyone knows not to touch my stuff, and everyone that comes onto my property leaves happy, generally speaking, and that's kind of the natural order of things. Did that answer more or less your question?
Just a quick follow-up. So you're... All right. Sorry, I'm trying to regain my train of thought. But you said something right at the end of the last one about tearing down the idols. So if it's basically a waste of time to focus on like all these other things when we're essentially worshiping those things as being the answer apart from God, apart from personal obedience.
Right. What I was basically saying is salvation lies in Jesus Christ alone.
Right.
And salvation doesn't, it does not lie in the law of God. We know that, right? You read Romans and you're like, you almost get this antinomian idea, you start reading Romans, but you have to read it very carefully what he's talking about. And that is kind of where we're looking to generally. I think we almost have been poisoned in our minds. Public school system, statism and the state for so long. I mean, we've been 400 years inside a state system where we have what Ron Paul calls, a monopoly of force. Where before that, you didn't have the monopoly of force. Everyone had to pay for their own actions. Nobody was immune. Everyone was on the same level of having to, interact with each other. So
the question is, let's say you do actually address that with a group of people,
right.
And you've torn down some idols, and now you have a group of people, Christian, devout, God-fearing Christian people who are following God only, and attempting to implement His laws in their lives personally and in their Christian community.
Yeah.
Now, how do you deal with now that those idols are torn down for them? How do you deal with the fact that they still live within a much larger pagan system that is committing acts of murder, homosexuality, and other,
well, I think that's
crimes
where,
on a daily basis?
Yeah, that's where I was addressing. The fact is that I think we're very concerned about what other people are doing and not what we're doing. So we look at these Hasidic Jews. They move into an area and they totally abolish the school system, and everybody else just ended up moving out. Talk about a plan of action. I like it. Didn't happen. Didn't take very long. Stuff like that is interesting, but they can't do anything about that larger deal. That's where we're still back in that stage of hearts and minds and breaking down those idols for everyone else. So I think one of the biggest problems that we have as Christians is the faith that obeying God is going to bring blessing. You call 911, right? And you have faith that somebody's going to come. But do we have the faith when we rely upon God and His ways that we will be blessed like He says? Go ahead.
Okay, so here's the point I'm trying to get at.
Okay.
At some point, as a Christian obeying God's law, you might be faced with putting someone to death for the crime of murder.
Right, yeah. Okay, let's cover
when
that
does
one.
that occur and how? And obviously there's going to be...
Yeah, let me explain that one. People ask me many times, I don't call the police. Like, if I get robbed or anything, it's just going to be. However, yeah. Well, here's the deal. I sometimes will have to call the police for certain things because I could get in trouble with them for not calling them. But for the rest of the time, it's like if someone wrongs me in business, my immediate reaction is not actually to go to my beloved court system and run a petition. I'm just going to be defrauded, as Paul said, because I don't want to give credence to that system. So some stuff we have to do because it's just like the Christians in Rome had to deal with certain things. And in some cases, they literally fled because it was just too hard for them. They were driven out. And so we naturally, I'm not going to, I don't think God is looking at us and going, oh, they should be doing all this stuff when you can't. When you're still being oppressed. If you can imagine Daniel and the children of Israel were oppressed, they can't do much where they are because they're still under judgment. And when they were done being under judgment, then they could go back to their, to the obedience. And I think we're not there when we're just a tiny little community. It just has to grow.
We kind of, in some sense, have that right now, right? Like there has to be a plaintiff in order for there to be a case, right? And unfortunately, in our state, like I'm sure that you're saying, in a majority of cases, the state is assuming the role of being the plaintiff on everyone's behalf, which is not biblical. Which would be better is that individuals are their own plaintiffs on their behalf, right? But there should be like some sort of there should be an offended person.
Yeah, there is a thing that you'd have to understand more about the court system to understand that there is essentially no choice of law. Not really. It's like, should I kill you by hanging or kill you by, shooting? And as if that was a choice. I'd choose the one about the not dying part, right? But they act like you had some sort of a choice. You don't have the choice of, you have a false choice of venue, you have a false choice of judges. And so the system that God has created, if we were to try to take over what we currently have, it just doesn't fit the model. Because it has paid employees, now I can imagine a judge would be paid, in God's biblical system. But it would be, again, a voluntary transaction. Maybe you go to the cheaper judge. You don't have to go to the more expensive one. Literally.
All right. Last question.
Go ahead.
It's gonna come from me. Do you advocate a church? Do you advocate a court system through your local church?
I advocate a biblical system, and that I think that biblical system was laid out by one of our greater lawyers in all of history, which would be Paul, selected for that. And he very clearly states that a church should be able to judge among itself. Even the least members should be able to be a judge among themselves. And in fact, if you read Rushdoony's, just the Institutes and any of Gary North's stuff, the historical deal with the church was they had gained so much respect in being fair and righteous in their judgment that the pagans were coming to be judged at the church courts. And so, yeah, I absolutely advocate that. How we view authority, though, needs to come also from Scripture. So the standard by which we judge, also the standard by which we organize and administrate as law, is also something that needs to be obeyed. And I think that that's something very much in any online debates and stuff that I've had. People are missing the form as well as the standard. So there's a standard for the form itself.
Thanks.